I hadn't planned on riding out that afternoon. The sky had already turned heavy, the kind of gray that hangs low and presses on your shoulders. The wind had that sharp edge that comes before a storm, whispering through the trees like it had news I didn't want to hear. Most days, I would have stayed in, put another log on the fire, let the weather pass. But something in the air was restless, unsettled, and it stirred something in me. I couldn't name it, but I've learned to trust that feeling. The northern fence line isn't far, just enough of a ride to remind me I still live on land worth checking. A few acres of pasture, most of it tired. A barn that leans more than it stands. And me, 48 years old, living with nothing but an old dog and the ghosts I've stopped trying to chase away. I saddled Scout, my mare, without much thought. She's steady, sure-footed, doesn't ask for more than she needs, and maybe that's why I like her. We set out just past 5. The sun was already slipping behind the thick clouds, turning the light thin, fan, and dim. The trail was soft under Scout's hooves, not muddy yet, but I could feel the give in the ground. That smell rose up, dry grass about to drink the first rain, and I knew it wouldn't be long before the sky opened. The fence looked fine when I reached it. I almost turned back right there, but at the bend in the trail, maybe 100 yards down, I saw something. At first I thought it was a log. Then I realized it was the wrong color for that, too still to be a deer. I slowed Scout to a stop, listened, just whined in the first lazy drops of rain hitting leaves. I nudged her forward, eyes fixed on the shape. It was a woman, sitting in the mud with her legs tucked under her, back against the slope like she'd run out of strength before she'd run out of road. Her dress was soaked through, clinging to her in a way that made me want to look away. One sleeve torn at the shoulder, one boot missing, the other half buried in muck. Her hair was a tangled mess, maybe red under the dirt and rain, hanging down over most of her face. I swung down from Scout, moving slow. I've dealt with spooked animals and spooked people, and the trick is the same. Don't rush. My boots sank into the mud as I took a few steps closer. She turned her head just enough for me to see her face, pale under the grime. Her eyes locked on me, sharp but hollow, the kind of look you get when you're unmeasuring if someone is trouble. "You hurt?" I asked, my voice low and rough from days without speaking. No answer. "Where are you coming from?" I tried again. Still nothing. I crouched down, careful not to close the distance too much. The rain was falling harder now, finding its way down the back of my neck. "Storm will be bad," I said, just stating the truth. "Can't stay out here." She turned her face away. Her lips moved, but no sound came. I glanced back toward the rise where my cabin sat, just visible through the trees. Bringing her back wasn't what I'd set out to do. I didn't want this, a stranger, a woman carrying whatever kind of trouble had put her here, but I also couldn't leave her. I pulled off my coat and draped it around her shoulders. She flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. The coat swallowed her whole. I didn't offer to carry her, just waited. After a minute, she tried to stand, slipped, then tried again. I stepped in and steadied her with one arm, careful, like I was handling a half-broke colt. "You'll sleep in my house tonight," I said. It wasn't a question. By the time we made it back, the light was almost gone. The cabin smelled like cedar and old coffee. Bo, my dog, lifted his head from the corner by the fire, gave a low grunt, then went back to sleep. I sat her on the edge of the bed and stoked the fire until the wood popped and hissed. I fetched towels, dry socks, a wool blanket. She didn't say a word, didn't ask my name, and I didn't press. Too much fear on her face, not the kind that comes from cold, but the kind that comes from being hunted. I handed her a cup of warm water, then turned my back so she could peel off the wet clothes if she wanted. I heard the faint rustle, then the sound of her settling on the bed. She stayed upright, back to the wall. I poured 2 mugs of leftover stew, beans and venison, and handed one to her. She held it for a while before taking a few small bites. "I'm not going to ask," I said finally. "Not tonight." She blinked once. "You're safe here," I added, "and that's not something I've said to anyone in a long time." She gave the smallest nod. Outside, the wind slammed against the shutters. Inside, the fire burned steady. 2 strangers sat in a room that had only ever held one life, and I knew something had changed, even if I didn't yet know what it meant. If you've been listening and this story's got its hooks in you already, do me a favor. Hit that like button, drop a comment, and follow the channel. Sometimes it's the smallest sign that tells a person they're not walking their road alone. It had been years since this cabin held more than one person overnight. 10, maybe. I'd lost track because I'd stopped marking time that way after Sarah passed. The quiet had become a sort of companion to me, one that didn't ask questions or make demands, and I thought I liked it that way. But that night, with her sitting there wrapped in my coat, I realized the quiet was different now. It wasn't just mine anymore. I moved around the cabin like I always did, each task precise, but my mind kept circling back to the fact that there was someone else breathing under this roof. She didn't say a word, not when I set a second blanket near her, not when I stirred the fire until it threw more heat. She sat with her knees pulled up, back pressed to the wall, eyes following every movement I made. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the kind of watchfulness that comes from having to be careful for too long. Bo, my old dog, shuffled to his feet at one point, gave her a sniff from a safe distance, then curled back up in his corner. That was all the welcome she was going to get from him, and truth be told, from me too. For now. I'd never been one for small talk, and I sure wasn't about to start spilling stories to a woman who hadn't even given me her name. Still, I found myself noticing things I wouldn't normally think about. The way her hands shook when she held the cup I'd given her, the way her eyes flicked toward the door each time the wind hit it, like she was making sure it would stay shut. I respected that. I've had my own days of needing to keep one eye on the exits. When I turned in for the night, I expected her to stay on the bed and me to take the chair. But she slid down to the floor instead, curling herself between the stove and the woodpile, like she wanted a wall at her back and heat at her front. I let her. You don't move someone out of the place they've chosen if it helps them sleep. I lay there listening to the storm outside, the wind working its way through the gaps in the shutters, the rain tapping on the roof. It was the same sound I'd heard 1,000 nights before, but somehow it felt sharper with her here. I kept thinking how easy it would be for her to leave in the morning, how I might wake to find my coat gone and the bed still cold. I didn't want to admit, even to myself, that the thought sat heavy on me. Morning came slow, the storm having wrung itself out overnight. The light that filtered through the small window was pale, touched with mist. I was up before the fire had gone cold, boots scuffing the floor as I stirred the embers back to life. That's when she gave me her name. Just one word, soft as if it had to be coaxed out of hiding. Asia. No last name, no details, just that. I nodded, said nothing else. Names are only as useful as the trust they come with, and I wasn't going to press for more. She stayed curled up in the blankets while I boiled water and fried cornbread in the skillet. I set a plate on the table, and after a pause, she joined me. Ate slow, careful, but didn't waste a bite. When she finished, she cleared her own plate, rinsed it at the basin without me asking. It struck me then how quickly she'd folded herself into the rhythm of the place, not as someone settling in, but as someone making sure they weren't a burden. I'd seen that before, too. By mid-morning, I had to ride out to check the south side of the property, and when I told her I'd be back before noon, she just nodded. No fear, no request to come along, just that same watchful calm. When I returned, the cabin was warmer, the floor swept, the fire high. My old kettle was clean and steaming with water. She'd found one of my shirts and changed into it, her dress hanging near the stove to dry. I didn't comment. Out here, you notice what people do more than what they say. That evening, I sat at the table cleaning my rifle while she mended a tear in the sleeve of a coat I hadn't worn in months. No questions, no explanations, just work being done side by side. It felt steady. I caught myself thinking it had been a long time since the cabin had seen this kind of quiet that wasn't empty, quiet that was full of presence. She still kept to the edges of the room, still angled her chair so she could see the door, but there was less tightness in her shoulders. I didn't tell her I noticed. Later, when I banked the fire for the night, she returned to her place on the floor without a word. I stood there for a moment, watching her fold the blanket around herself, the shadows from the flames dancing across her face. I felt something I hadn't in a long while, an urge to make sure she stayed warm, that she had enough to eat, that the door would hold against the wind. I told myself it was just habit, the same way I check on the livestock before a storm. But deep down, I knew it was different. It had been years since this house held two people. Years since I'd had to listen for someone else's breathing in the dark, or consider whether the water in the kettle was enough for more than one. And now, somehow, in the space of a single night, the air inside these walls had shifted. It wasn't just my space anymore. I didn't know if she'd be here tomorrow or the day after, but for now, she was, and the cabin didn't feel as empty. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't either. It didn't take long before I started noticing the little ways she moved through the cabin, the kind of things you only catch when you've lived alone long enough to know every sound the place makes. Asia didn't speak much, but she worked quiet, and there was something deliberate in that quiet. She'd set the tin cup just to the right of my plate every evening, like it had always been there. The firewood stack by the door began to grow taller without me asking. I'd find the broom leaning in a different place, a clean sweep mark through the dust, the kind you only see when the sun angles in just right. None of it was loud, none of it asked for thanks. It was as if she was learning the rhythm of the place the same way you learn the pace of a horse, by watching, by keeping time in your head until the steps feel like your own. She still avoided the windows. At first, I thought it was just the cold. But then I saw how she'd tack an old quilt over the one near the table, nails hammered in at an angle like she'd done it before. It was crude, but sure. A way of shutting out the world, or maybe keeping the world from looking in. I didn't ask why, I just let her have it. I know what it's like to need the walls to hold a little tighter. Her hands were always busy, mending a shirt she'd pulled from the old trunk, scrubbing the kettle until it looked newer than it was, folding the laundry before I even noticed it had been washed. And the thing is, she didn't do it like someone trying to pay their way. She did it like someone who needed their hands to be occupied so their mind wouldn't wander somewhere dark. I understood that too. Sometimes I'd catch her pausing, standing in the doorway between the kitchen nook and the main room, looking around like she was taking inventory. Not of things, but of space where the walls met, where the doors sat, where the shadows fell. She didn't stay in one place too long unless she had her back against something solid. I never came up behind her without making a sound first. You learn to respect the edges people draw around themselves. We didn't talk much those first days, but the silence didn't feel empty. It was a working kind of silence where two people could share space without having to fill it. I'd seen other kinds of quiet before, the brittle kind, the kind that was full of things unsaid and ready to snap. This wasn't that. This was steady, like the hum of a stove when the fire's right. At night, she still slept close to the stove, wrapped in the wool blanket, her back to the wood pile. I'd lie in my bed and listen to the soft sound of her shifting once or twice, Bo's breathing in the corner, the faint pop of a log breaking down in the heat. It was strange, hearing more than just my own breath in the dark. I thought it might bother me, but it didn't. It felt less lonely. One evening, I came in from checking the south fence to find the table cleared and a small pot on the stove, steam curling from it. She didn't say a word, just ladled stew into my bowl and slid it across. I sat, nodded once, and we ate in that easy silence we'd fallen into. Halfway through, I noticed the way her shoulders had eased, not hunched the way they'd been that first night. She started humming after that, not every day, and not when she knew I was close enough to hear. But once, I was mending a harness by the window and caught the faint thread of a tune drifting from the kitchen. It wasn't a song I recognized. Maybe it wasn't even a song, but it carried something soft in it. The moment she realized I'd heard, it stopped. She looked over, half apologetic. "Didn't mean to," she said. I just told her, didn't mind it. I kept my questions to myself. Where she'd been, what had put her out in the cold that day, who might be looking for her. It wasn't that I didn't want to know. I just knew that asking too soon could make a person pack up and disappear, and I didn't want her to disappear. There was a weight in her presence that made the place feel more like a home and less like a shelter I was just passing time in. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me when she thought I wasn't looking, not with suspicion anymore, but with the same kind of curiosity I had about her. Two people trying to figure out if the other one was a safe place to set their pack down. By the end of the first week, the cabin had taken on a different feel. The air inside wasn't still the way it had been when I lived alone. It moved soft steps across the floor, the rustle of fabric, the occasional low laugh when Bo did something clumsy. And it wasn't just the space that was changing. I could feel something shifting in me too. I found myself cutting more firewood than I needed, making sure the stove never burned too low at night. I'd fixed things around the place that I'd let go for years. It was as if having someone else here gave me a reason to tend to more than just the bare necessities. I didn't know then how long she'd stay, or if she even thought about staying at all. But I knew that, in these small, careful ways, we were learning each other. Learning where the edges were and how not to cross them too soon. Learning that silence can be a kind of conversation if you let it. And maybe most of all, learning that sometimes you can tell more about a person by the things they don't say than by the things they do. It was late in the afternoon the first time she gave me more than her name. The day had been gray and cold, the kind where the light never seems to shift, just stays the same muted shade until the sun gives up and disappears. We'd been working in the shed, mending a hinge on the barn door that had started to sag, each of us focused on our own part of the task. The sound of the hammer against wood filled the space, steady and even, until I noticed her sleeve had slid back, and there, faint but unmistakable, were the shadows of old bruises around her wrist. They weren't fresh, but they told a story all the same. I didn't mention it. Some things you don't call attention to unless you're invited. Still, it stayed with me the rest of the day, like a pebble in my boot. That night, we sat at the table, her with a mending kit, me cleaning an old revolver I hadn't touched in years. The firelight threw long shadows across the floor, the air warm but quiet in that way I'd grown to appreciate. I ran the cloth down the barrel, oiled the moving parts, checked the cylinder like muscle memory had never left me. I didn't look up when I said, "If anyone ever comes for you, I'll deal with it." My voice was calm, not a threat, not a promise meant to impress, just the plain truth. She stopped stitching for a moment, the needle suspended in midair. Her mouth twitched like she might say something, but instead, she nodded once and went back to her work. That was enough for me. A few days later, it was her who spoke first. I was sitting by the stove patching a worn saddle strap, hands working slow, when she said, "I taught children once." Her voice was steady, not soft, like she'd been carrying the words for a while and finally set them down. I looked up, not to push her, but to let her know I was listening. "In Missouri," she continued, eyes on the mug in her hands. "Second grade. I liked it. They were curious, always asking why." She let out a small breath, part laugh, part something else. "My husband didn't like me working, said it made him look weak." I didn't interrupt. "At first it was just words," she said, her fingers tracing the rim of the cup. "Then it turned into more." She didn't have to explain what more meant. The bruises had already spoken for her. "I left when I could, took the back road. I'd been walking for days when you found me." She lifted her eyes then, and for a moment I saw past the guarded way she carried herself. There was exhaustion there, yes, but also a kind of relief, like saying it out loud made it more real. I wanted to tell her she'd done the right thing, that leaving took more courage than most people had in them, but I've never been much for speeches, so I just nodded. Inside, though, I felt something shift. It wasn't pity. I've never thought much of pity but recognition. I knew what it was to have the ground pulled out from under you, to have the life you built collapse without warning. Mine had fallen apart for different reasons, but the ache that follows, that was the same. In the days that followed, she started moving differently, still cautious, still watching the corners of the room, but her steps had a little more weight to them, like she wasn't trying so hard to disappear. She started carrying buckets from the well without me asking, mending the barn doors without flinching when the wind slammed them shut. Even Bo, who usually kept to himself, started following her outside, trailing her with the kind of quiet loyalty dogs give to those they've decided belong. One morning I came in from splitting wood and found her standing near the stove with her hands wrapped around a mug. "Why didn't you ask me where I came from that first night?" she said without turning. I set my gloves down on the table. "Didn't need to," I told her. "You were cold, you were hurt, that was enough." She was quiet for a moment, then I saw her shoulders loosen, the tension slipping out like air from a held breath. She didn't say thank you, but she didn't have to. The look in her eyes when she turned toward me said more than words could have managed. That was the night she took down the quilt from the window. She did it without announcing it, just pulled the nails out, folded the fabric, and set it neatly on the chair. For the first time, the cabin had an unbroken view of the trees outside. I didn't comment, but when I lay down that night, I noticed she didn't stir once. It's a strange thing, learning someone's history in fragments. You don't get a straight line from start to finish, just pieces scattered across days, tied together by small moments of trust. A mug of coffee set in the same place every morning. A jacket mended without being asked. A name spoken in the quiet when no one else is around to hear it. That's how you learn a person who's had to keep themselves hidden. You pay attention to what they let you see, and you don't force the rest. I didn't know if Asia had told me everything, or if there were chapters she'd never open, but I knew enough to understand that she'd been running for longer than she should have had to, and that stopping, really stopping, was going to take time. I also knew that whatever had chased her here wasn't going to cross my land without a fight, and maybe that was when I realized something else. I hadn't just offered her shelter from the cold that first night. Somewhere along the way, I'd decided she wasn't just passing through. And the truth was, I didn't want her to. I'd gone most of my life thinking I was done with guns. After Sarah passed, I put them away like I put away everything else that reminded me of the man I used to be. The revolver went into a wooden box in the trunk at the foot of my bed, oiled, wrapped in cloth, and left alone. I told myself I didn't need it anymore. The truth was, I didn't want to feel that weight in my hand, didn't want to be the man who needed it, but the night I saw the faint yellow marks around Asia's wrist, I knew that some promises don't get kept without steel behind them. It was late fall by then, the wind outside carrying that dry bite that comes before the first real snow. We'd spent the day patching the shed roof. I'd been on the ladder, hammer in hand, and she'd been holding a board steady below me. When I glanced down to check the alignment, her sleeve had slipped back, and I saw them. Those faint bruises, not fresh but still lingering, like shadows of fingers that had once wrapped too tight. My stomach tightened. I didn't say a word. Just finished the job, climbed down, and went back inside. But I thought about it all evening, the picture of her standing there, braced against the wind, trying to keep the board still while carrying something heavier than the wood in her hands. After dinner, she sat at the table mending one of my old coats, the one I hadn't worn since before Sarah died. I took the revolver out of the trunk and set it on the table, the wood creaking under its weight. I could feel her eyes on me as I opened the cylinder, checked it, and began wiping it down. I didn't rush. My hands knew the steps like they'd been carved into the bone. "If anyone ever comes for you," I said without looking up, "I'll deal with it." She kept her needle moving for a second, then stopped. Her hands stilled over the fabric. When I finally looked at her, she was watching me, something unreadable in her face. Then she gave a single, deliberate nod and went back to stitching. That was all. No thank you, no questions, just a quiet acknowledgement. And somehow, that was more than enough. The next morning, I found her outside before the sun was high, carrying buckets from the well. She didn't say anything about the gun, and I didn't either. But I noticed her eyes didn't dart toward the windows as often. She moved with a touch more certainty, like she knew the ground under her feet had become something she could stand on. A few days later, I decided to put the weight in her own hands. We'd finished stacking firewood out back when I went inside and came out with the revolver again. I set it on the table between us. "Don't have to use it," I said, "but you should know how." She didn't reach for it at first, just stared at it like she was measuring the cost of touching it. Then she looked up at me and whispered, "Thank you." Not like someone saying thanks for a gift, but like someone recognizing what it meant to be trusted with it. We went out behind the barn. I set up tin cans on a fallen log, handed her the revolver, and showed her the basics: how to hold it, how to breathe, how not to fight the recoil. The first few shots went wide. On the third, she flinched hard, and I thought she might hand it back, but she didn't. She squared her shoulders, set her jaw, and kept going. On the sixth shot, she hit the center of a can so clean it spun off the log. "Not bad," I said. She glanced at me sideways, the faintest edge of a smile tugging at her mouth. I wasn't aiming, I smirked, just barely. "Still counts." After that, I noticed she slept a little more soundly. She still kept the pistol close, but I stopped seeing her glance toward the door every time the wind knocked a branch against the cabin. There was a steadiness in her now, the kind that comes from knowing you've got something between you and whatever might be coming. One evening, as I was banking the fire, she said, "I never thought I'd touch one of those again." Her voice was quiet, almost to herself. I didn't ask what she meant. Some things you let be, because the saying of them might open a door she's not ready to walk through. But I understood enough. Guns are tools, but they're also memories, and the memory of holding one can be heavier than the gun itself. I'd seen that in men before. Now I saw it in her, but I also saw something else, a glint of resolve in the way she cleaned the revolver after we came in, the way she set it back down on the table without flinching. It reminded me of something my father once told me, back before I left home. "You don't carry it so you can use it. You carry it so you don't have to." That night, when she folded herself into the bed instead of the floor, still fully dressed and facing the wall, I felt the cabin shift again. The quiet wasn't just quiet anymore, it was holding something. A promise. Maybe two. I lay there in the dark, listening to Beau's slow breathing and the faint whistle of the wind through the eaves, and I realized I hadn't thought about putting the gun back in the box. I didn't know how long she'd be here, but as long as she was, I'd keep it close. Some things, once said, can't be taken back, and some things, once decided, shouldn't be. You can tell when someone is just waiting for the right moment to leave. I've seen it in drifters, in men passing through, in folks who never quite set their pack down. Asia didn't move like that anymore. She still kept certain habits, sleeping on the edge of the bed, staying near a wall when she sat, but there was something new in the way she went about the days. It was in the quiet, steady way she took the broom in the mornings, without being asked, or the way she folded my shirts with the cuffs smoothed just so. It was in how she stopped glancing toward the door every time the wind shifted, and how Beau, who could sense a stranger's nerves better than most people, had started curling at her feet in the evenings. The work around the place isn't complicated, but it's constant. You split wood, you haul water, you mend what the wind or the years have worn down. Some people find that endless repetition dull. I've always found it keeps a man grounded. Asia fell into it like she'd been here all along. She'd feed the chickens while I checked the fence. I'd come in from the shed to find the floor swept, the kettle full, the fire stoked high. We didn't speak much while we worked, but there was a comfort in knowing where the other one was without looking. I started cutting more firewood than usual, stacking it high by the door. I told myself it was just because winter was coming early, but the truth was, I liked knowing she'd never have to reach for an empty woodpile. She noticed, but she didn't comment. Instead, she added another quilt to the bed, started boiling water earlier, so the basin wouldn't freeze by morning. Little things that told me she was thinking ahead, too. It was around this time I heard her laugh for the first time. Beau had slipped on the frost, chasing one of the chickens, landing flat on his side with his legs in the air. I was standing by the fence, ready to help him up, but before I could move, I heard it, a short, surprised laugh that she tried to hide behind her hand. She caught me looking at her and said, "What?" like she didn't know what I'd just seen. I shook my head. "Nothing." But I thought about that sound for the rest of the day. She hummed sometimes now, too. Not loud, not a tune I could name, but just enough to thread through the quiet when she thought I wasn't paying attention. I'd catch it while I was mending tack or sharpening a blade. The moment she realized I'd noticed, she'd stop, but I told her once, didn't mind it. She'd given me a small nod, but I could tell it meant more than she let on. Evenings had their own rhythm. We'd eat, sometimes stew, sometimes cornbread and beans, and then settle into our corners of the room. She'd mend or read by the fire, and I'd work a whetstone over my knife, the sound slow and steady. The light from the fire softened the space between us, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel like it was holding its breath. One night, she surprised me by setting a small loaf of bread on the table. "Found your old pan in the cupboard," she said, like that explained it. The crust was uneven, the center a little soft, but it was the first bread baked in that cabin since Sarah. I didn't say that out loud. I just sliced it, poured coffee, and we ate in the kind of quiet that says more than words could. I noticed she'd started sleeping deeper. The small movements she used to make in the night, the quick turns, the restless shifts were fewer. Sometimes I'd wake in the dark and hear only the even sound of her breathing. It settled something in me I hadn't realized was unsettled. There were still boundaries. She never asked about Sarah. and I never asked more about the man she left behind. But those boundaries didn't feel like walls anymore. They felt like markers on a trail we were both learning to walk without rushing. I didn't need to know everything to know she was here for now, and she didn't need my whole story to know I meant what I'd said about anyone who came for her. It's strange how fast a place can change without you noticing. One week it's yours alone, the next it's got someone else's shape in it. The chair across from mine was no longer empty at meals. The hook by the door held her coat next to mine. The quilt on the bed was pulled up for two. None of it felt like an intrusion. It felt right. Like the cabin had been waiting for this without either of us knowing it. I've lived enough years to know nothing stays the same. Seasons shift, people leave, storms come whether you're ready or not. But that stretch of days when we settled into our rhythm, it felt steady in a way I hadn't had in a long time. And steady can be a kind of gift, especially to people who've spent too much of their lives moving. I didn't know if Asia thought about staying beyond the winter. I didn't ask. All I knew was she wasn't moving like someone with one foot out the door anymore, and for now, that was enough. The snow came sooner than I'd expected. Not the kind that dusts the ground and melts by noon, but heavy, wet, and fast, the sort that makes the world go white before you can finish your first cup of coffee. I'd felt it before it started, the way the air pressed in, the way the roof beams gave a slow, tired groan during the night. By dawn, the flakes were coming hard enough to blur the tree line. It was the kind of snow that didn't last long this early in the season, but it could still do damage. I was already thinking about the north pasture. That gate had been loose for weeks, and a storm like this could blow it clean open. If it did, the cattle could wander too close to the ridge, and I wasn't willing to risk losing them. Asia was at the window, watching the snow pile against the fence posts. "Shouldn't wait," she said when I told her where I was headed. I shook my head. "Can't. Too close to the edge if the gate blows open." She didn't argue, just handed me the old flask from the shelf. "Hot tea," she said. I took it and nodded, pulling on my gloves. I didn't make it back in the hour I promised. The wind up there was stronger than I'd counted on, pushing hard against me every step. I found the gate half hanging already, the snow drifting in waves against the posts. I wrestled it back into place, but on the way down, my boot caught on a buried root, and I went down hard. Pain shot up my leg so quick it knocked the breath out of me. I sat there in the snow, back against a dead tree, trying to will the stars out of my vision. Scout stood nearby, reins tangled in a low bush, her breath puffing white in the cold. I heard her before I saw her. The crunch of boots in the snow, the quick rhythm of someone moving with purpose. Then she was there, kneeling beside me, her hair stiff with frost. "Can you stand?" she asked, looking me over. "Not without seeing stars," I said. She glanced around, no help in sight for 10 miles, and then said, "We'll get back. You'll lean on me." I almost laughed, but it came out more like a groan. "You'll break." "Try me," she said, and there was no give in her voice. It took the better part of an hour to get back. I leaned heavy on her shoulder, my weight driving her into the snow with every step, but she didn't complain. Her jaw was set, her breath coming hard, but she kept going. By the time we reached the cabin, both of us were soaked to the knees, her hair frozen into stiff strands. She helped me into the chair by the fire, stripped off my coat, and pulled my boot away, slow, wincing with me when I grunted. The ankle was swollen and dark already. She didn't waste time. Cleaned it, wrapped it tight, set water to boil. I'd never seen her move so quickly, so sure of herself. I watched her work, the pain in my leg sharp but distant, compared to the thought that she looked like she belonged here, not as a guest, but as someone taking charge of what needed doing. "You've done this before," I said as she adjusted the bandage. "I was a nurse before I taught," she said, not looking up. It was the first time she'd mentioned it. The next 2 days, I didn't leave that chair except to hobble to bed at night. She took over everything, feeding the animals, hauling wood, keeping the fire high. She read aloud from an old almanac sometimes, not because either of us cared about planting cycles from 10 years back, but because it filled the silence. Her voice was steady, stronger than it had been since the day I found her. I hated feeling useless, but I let her run things. And in letting her, I saw something I hadn't seen before, a woman who wasn't just surviving, but holding ground. On the third night, I woke to a sound outside. Could have been the wind, could have been something else. I reached for my rifle, but stopped when I saw her at the window, one hand holding the pistol I'd given her. Her posture was straight, no shaking in her grip. She stared into the dark for a long minute, then lowered the gun. "Just wind," she said, and came back to the fire. Before lying down, she looked at me and said, "You ever wonder why I stopped running?" I didn't answer right away. "Because it felt like dying," she said quietly. "And then this place, it didn't." I looked at the fire. "It still might hurt. Don't vanish out here." "I know," she said, "but I'd rather be here with someone who doesn't look away." We didn't speak again that night. The fire burned low and the storm passed, but when morning came, she was the first to rise, moving about the cabin like she'd been doing it all her life, and I sat there, watching her, knowing I'd never see her the same way again. It was one of those afternoons where the sky couldn't decide if it wanted to snow or just hang there, heavy and gray. The air felt still, but not in a peaceful way, more like the pause before a storm. I'd just finished stacking the last of the chopped wood near the porch when I heard the sound of hooves. Not the quick, uneven rhythm of a stray animal, but the slow, deliberate beat of a man who wanted to be heard before he was seen. Asia was inside, stripping herbs for drying, the smell of sage and something sharp filling the room. I turned toward the trail and saw him, a tall man on a dark horse, coat long enough to brush the saddle, hat pulled low, boots dusted from miles of riding. The horse was good stock, well-fed, well-trained, the kind of animal that didn't wander anywhere by accident. He came down the narrow path without hurry, reined in, about 20 feet from the porch, and just sat there, studying the place like he was taking its measure. That was when Asia stepped outside. She froze mid-step, and I saw it, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the doorframe, the color draining from her face. She didn't speak, didn't move closer. The man's eyes slid past me and landed on her. "Asia," he said, her name hanging in the cold air like a hook. She didn't answer. "You know who this is?" I asked her, not taking my eyes off him. She gave a small, almost invisible nod. "Don't want to go with him?" I asked again, quieter this time. Her voice was steady but low. "No." That was all I needed. I stepped forward, my legs still aching from the fall in the snowstorm, but I stood tall enough. "She stays," I said. The rider's jaw shifted, working side to side like he was chewing on his next words. His hand drifted toward his belt, not drawn, but close enough to make a point. "I don't think you understand what's happening here," he said. "I understand enough," I told him. We stared at each other, the space between us holding more weight than the words. Behind me, I heard the soft crunch of Asia's boots on the porch. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw her step down, the pistol I'd taught her to use held steady in both hands. The man noticed too. His gaze flicked to her, narrowed. "She going to shoot me?" "No," I said. "She's going to wait and see if she has to." It went quiet then, the kind of quiet where every sound feels louder. The leather of his saddle creaked, a hawk called somewhere far off, even the wind seemed to hesitate. Then he looked at her one last time, something in his expression shifting, not anger, not fear, but disbelief, like he couldn't make sense of how she'd come to be standing here with a man who'd stand in front of her without asking for anything in return. He turned his horse sharply and rode back the way he'd come. No threats, no backward glance, just retreat. Asia stayed where she was until the sound of hooves faded into the trees. I walked over to her slow. "You all right?" I asked. She nodded, still gripping the pistol. "I didn't think I could do that," she said quietly. "You didn't have to," I told her. "I did." Her eyes were clear, her breath steady. I studied her for a moment. "I don't know who he was," I said, "and I don't care, but he's not coming back." She kept her gaze on the tree line. "No," she said, "he won't." That night, we didn't talk much. Bo curled between us on the floor, his head resting on his paws, the fire burning low. Something in the cabin felt different, not lighter exactly, but stronger, like the walls themselves had braced against the wind. Before going to bed, Asia walked to the last window that still had a curtain over it. She reached up, pulled the nails free, and let the fabric fall. The room felt more open instantly, the view of the dark trees stretching out into the night. She folded the curtain neatly and set it aside. I didn't say anything, didn't have to. That was her way of telling me the worst of the running was over. When she lay down that night, she didn't check the door twice, didn't carry the pistol to bed, and when I lay there listening to the fire crackle, I realized I'd stopped waiting for the sound of her boots leaving in the dark. The world wouldn't stop throwing storms our way. I'd lived too long to believe otherwise, but this one, we'd faced it together, and that counted for something I hadn't felt in years. Winter didn't leave all at once. It loosened its grip slowly, like an old man reluctant to get out of his chair. The snow lingered in the shaded places, clinging to the edges of the trees where the sun couldn't quite reach, melting into rivulets that fed the stubborn patches of frost. Each day the light lasted a little longer, and the mornings felt less like a fight to stay warm. I was back on my feet by then, still limping some from the ankle, but moving without the cane. Asia kept pace with me when I walked the property, sometimes right beside me, sometimes a few yards off, always within view. She didn't ask where I was going or how far. She just came. The garden patch she'd asked for behind the shed was still hard, the soil cold and crusted, but she'd started working it anyway. I'd watch from the fence line, her sleeves rolled up, fingers raw from turning the earth. She didn't move like someone passing time. She moved like someone making a place hers. I built her a small fence around it, not to keep animals out, just to mark it, to give it a border. She ran her hand along the rails when it was done, not saying anything, but the way she stood there told me she understood the gesture. Our evenings settled into something I'd stopped believing I'd have again. We'd share a meal, still mostly in silence, but not the kind that presses down on you. Her chair across from mine never sat empty. My coffee cup always had a second one beside it in the mornings. She started leaving small signs of herself in the cabin, a book on the table, a pair of mended gloves on the windowsill, the scent of herbs drying near the stove. Those little things made the place feel less like four walls holding me in and more like something alive. One morning, she stepped out onto the porch barefoot, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her hair down. The air was still cool, but not biting. I was already outside, sharpening a hoe, and I asked, "You sleep all right?" She gave a small smile. "Better than I ever have." I didn't say anything to that, just nodded, but inside I felt something loosen. Bo had taken to following her out to the creek in the afternoons. I watched from the window one day as she tossed him sticks, his old legs carrying him better than they had in years, tail up, barking like he was young again. She laughed when he came back soaked, shaking water all over her skirt. I stayed at the window longer than I meant to, telling myself I was checking the weather. Truth was, I just liked seeing her there. One afternoon, I brought out a saddle blanket I'd stitched together from old shirts and scrap cloth, pieced in uneven squares, but solid. I laid it across Dusty's back and called her over. "You ready to ride again?" I asked. She smiled, not just with her mouth, but with her whole body. "Yeah," she said. "Let's go." We rode along the edge of the property, the snowmelt pooling in the low spots, the trees starting to bloom. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, wildflowers, and pine warmed by the sun. We didn't talk much, but we stopped often, not to rest, just to look. At one spot, we sat side by side on a fallen log, watching the hills in the distance. She kept her eyes forward when she asked, "Does it ever go away?" "What's that?" I said. "The part that remembers." I ran a hand over my jaw. "No, but it quiets down." She nodded slowly. "I used to think I'd never stop running. Now, I think I just needed somewhere to stand still." Then she turned to me. "You gave me that." I didn't answer right away. When I did, I said, "You stayed." She shook her head. That wasn't me. That was you." Back at the cabin, the day softened into evening. We sat on the porch with mugs in hand, Bo stretched at our feet. The sky turned orange, then pink, then that pale blue just before dark. A hawk circled high above the ridge, the land quiet all around us. I glanced at her and asked, "You think about leaving?" She shook her head. "No, this is home now." I didn't push for anything more, didn't need to. Home isn't always where you started, it's where you decide to stop. And somewhere between the first night I found her in the mud and this quiet evening on the porch, she'd decided. As the sun dipped below the hills, she leaned slightly against my shoulder. I didn't move away. I let her rest there, and for the first time in a very long while, I realized the cabin didn't feel haunted anymore. The silence inside wasn't full of ghosts or regrets. It was full of presence, of warmth. We'd both lost more than most could carry, but here we were, choosing to stay anyway, choosing to see what we could build from the pieces we had left. Spring came slow, like it wasn't sure it wanted to stay. The ground softened a layer at a time, the frost letting go only when the sun had been steady for days. The fields took on that pale green you only see in the first weeks, when the grass is still young and thin, bending easy in the wind. I'd taken to walking the full property again, ankle stiff some mornings, but holding fine. Asia came along most days, never in a hurry, sometimes trailing behind, sometimes beside me. It didn't matter where she walked, we both knew she was part of the place now. The garden she'd planned in the frozen months was finally taking shape. Rows cut neat, soil turned dark and ready. She worked it every morning, her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, moving with a quiet purpose. I built her a fence not because anything needed keeping out, but because I wanted her to have a line around something that was hers. She didn't say much when it was done, just rested her hand on the top rail and looked at me in that way she has when she knows I've done something for her without making a show of it. Inside, the cabin felt different. It wasn't just mine anymore. Her things lived in the same space as mine, and nothing about it felt crowded. A book she'd left open on the table, the smell of bread cooling on the counter, the soft weight of her quilt at night. These were all small things, but they were proof. You learn to notice proof when you've gone years without it. One morning she stepped onto the porch barefoot, a blanket around her shoulders. The sun was just starting to clear the ridge, laying soft light over the yard. "You sleep all right?" I asked, setting down the mug I was holding. She smiled, the kind that doesn't rush to leave. "Better than I ever have." Bo followed her everywhere now. In the afternoons, I'd see them down by the creek, her tossing sticks and him bounding after them like a pup, shaking water all over her when he came back. I'd stand at the window longer than I should, telling myself I was checking the weather, but really I just liked watching her in that piece of the day that was hers alone. A few weeks later, I brought out a saddle blanket I'd stitched from scraps, laid it over Dusty's back and asked, "You ready to ride again?" She said, "Yeah," without hesitation. We rode slow along the edges of the property, the air carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. We stopped at a ridge and sat on a fallen log, looking out at the hills. She asked, "Does it ever go away? The part that remembers?" I told her, "No, but it quiets down." She nodded like she already knew. "I used to think I'd never stop running," as she said. "Now I think I just needed somewhere to stand still." She turned to me then. "You gave me that." I thought about telling her she'd given me just as much, maybe more, but all I said was, "You stayed." She shook her head. "That wasn't me. That was you." Back at the cabin that night, we sat on the porch, mugs in hand, watching the sky fade from orange to pink to that deep blue just before night takes over. I asked, "You think about leaving?" She didn't even pause. "No, this is home now." That was enough for me. I've learned a few things since that day I found her in the mud, that sometimes you don't need to know the whole story to know someone belongs in your life. That safety isn't just walls and locks, it's knowing the person beside you will stand there when it matters. That healing isn't a moment, it's a slow, stubborn decision you make again and again, and maybe the biggest one, that even after years of living with nothing but your own shadow, you can still make room for someone else's. We didn't mark the day she stopped running, and we didn't need to. It's in the way she leaves the door open when she steps outside now. It's in the way she sleeps without a pistol under the pillow. It's in the way I catch myself listening for her laugh as much as I listen for the wind. Life out here will never be easy. Storms will come, fences will break, seasons will turn whether you're ready or not. But now, when I look across the table, there's someone looking back, and that's enough to make the hardest day worth walking through. If you've listened this far, I figure you already understand why I'm telling you this. Maybe you've lost something or someone. Maybe you've been running, or maybe you've been standing still so long you forgot you could move towards something better. Whatever it is, I'll tell you this, don't look away when it finally shows up. You might not get a second chance to recognize it. If this story has found you at the right time, then let me ask you for something. Hit that like button so I know it's reached someone. Leave a comment. Tell me what part stayed with you. And if you want to hear more, follow this channel. Sometimes all it takes is one voice, one story, to remind someone they're not walking alone.